The knock came at midnight, and Luke Mercer opened the door to find a young woman he had never seen in his life pressing a letter against his chest with both trembling hands. "Your father sent me here," she whispered. Luke stopped breathing. His father had been dead for 6 months. The letter was sealed in Samuel Mercer's own wax, stamped with the same worn cattle brand ring Luke had buried alongside him. Every instinct Luke possessed told him to close the door. Every instinct except the one his father had spent 30 years building inside him. If this story has ever made you wonder what a dead man's last promise looks like when it finally arrives, subscribe to this channel, follow until the final word, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far my father's story has traveled. The night had been quiet, the way only Montana nights are quiet. Not peaceful, but heavy, the kind of silence that sits on a man's chest and reminds him of everything he has not said, and everyone he has already lost. Luke Mercer had been sitting at his father's desk for the better part of 3 hours, not working, not reading, just sitting with his hands flat on the surface of the wood, the way a man sometimes needs to press himself against something solid to remember he is still present in the world. The ranch ledger was open in front of him. The numbers had stopped making sense an hour ago. He wasn't reading them anymore. He was just staring at his own father's handwriting in the margins. Little notes Samuel Mercer had made years earlier, corrections and observations in that cramped, deliberate script that Luke had spent his whole childhood watching, scratch across paper at this same desk. 6 months. Samuel Mercer had been gone for 6 months, and the ranch still felt like a man holding his breath. The knock came without warning. Not the loud, confident knock of a neighbor or a ranch hand who had forgotten something. This was the knock of someone who had been standing at that door for longer than was comfortable working up the courage to make contact at all. 3 soft strikes against the wood, and then silence so complete that Luke wondered for a half-second if he had imagined it. He hadn't imagined it. He crossed the front room in 8 strides and pulled the door open, and the first thing he registered was the cold. The Montana autumn had turned mean in the past week, and the air that pushed past the door was sharp enough to sting. The second thing he registered was the woman standing on his porch. She was young, mid-20s, maybe younger, though the exhaustion on her face made it difficult to be certain. Her dress was the color of a road, and her boots had been resoled at least twice and were failing a third time. Her hair had come loose from wherever she had pinned it and was falling across her face in the wind. She was clutching a leather satchel against her side with one arm, and in her other hand she was holding an envelope. Old leather, dark with handling sealed with red wax. She looked at him with eyes that were holding back something enormous. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was steadier than the rest of her looked. "Luke Mercer." "That's right." She held the envelope out. When he didn't take it immediately, she pressed it against his chest with both hands, and he felt the weight of it, not the physical weight, which was nothing but the other kind. The kind that comes from something that has been carried a long distance. "Your father sent me here." The words landed like a stone into still water, and the silence that followed them spread outward in all directions. Luke looked at the envelope. He looked at her face. He looked at the wax seal, and his stomach dropped 3 inches. Because he recognized it, the cattle brand stamp his father had used for 20 years pressed into red wax, the way Samuel Mercer had sealed every document that mattered. "My father," Luke said carefully, "died 6 months ago." "I know." She didn't flinch. "He wrote this letter 4 months before he died. He told me to bring it to you if I ever found myself with nowhere left to go." She paused. "I found myself with nowhere left to go." Luke stood in the doorway for a long moment. The wind moved between them. A horse shifted in the dark barn behind her, and the sound of it, that familiar grounding sound, was the only thing that felt real. "Come inside," he said. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee and didn't speak again until she had drunk half of it. Luke sat across from her and held the letter and didn't open it. He was not ready to open it. He needed to understand what he was looking at first. "Your name," he said. "Abigail Hayes." He had never heard that name in his life. He searched his memory with the particular thoroughness of a man who had grown up listening to his father talk. Samuel Mercer had been a talker, a storyteller, a man who filled a room with the history of every person he had ever known. Luke could recite the names of men his father had trailed cattle with 40 years before he was born. He had never once heard the name Hayes attached to anything. "How did you know my father?" Abigail set her mug down. She looked at him with an expression that was calculating something not in a dishonest way, but in the way of a person deciding how much of a difficult thing to say at once. "He knew my family," she said. "My parents. He helped us years ago when I was very young. I don't remember all of it clearly. I was 8 or 9. What I remember is that we were in trouble, and then a man came, and after he left we weren't in trouble anymore." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that ends ranches." She picked up her mug again. "We had an outbreak move through our cattle. Lost nearly everything in 6 weeks. My father was looking at losing the land." She paused. "He didn't lose it. Someone made sure he didn't. He never told me the name of the man who helped. Not until he was dying, and even then he only told me because he wanted me to understand why he had spent years repaying a debt to a stranger." Luke was quiet. "He told you it was Samuel Mercer?" "He told me it was Samuel Mercer." She nodded. "And he told me that if I was ever in the kind of trouble that had no other door, there was a letter I needed to deliver." Luke looked at the envelope in his hands. He turned it over. The seal was unbroken. His father's handwriting was on the front. Not his own name, but a single word: son. His throat closed. He set the letter on the table between them and pressed both hands flat on the wood, the way he had been pressing them against his father's desk an hour earlier, and he breathed. "I need you to tell me about yourself," he said, "before I open that." Abigail Hayes had been born in eastern Montana to a family that raised beef cattle on land that had been in her mother's family for 2 generations. Her father, Robert Hayes, was a quiet, methodical man who ran his operation with a careful hand and very little debt. Her mother had died when Abigail was 14, and from that point forward it had been the 2 of them, father and daughter, working the land and building towards something. 3 years ago her father had been thrown from a horse. The injury had seemed manageable at first, a broken arm, some bruised ribs. But something had gone wrong internally that none of the local doctors caught in time, and Robert Hayes had spent 18 months declining slowly and painfully before he died in the spring of this year. "He left me the land and the cattle and the debts," Abigail said. "And I tried. I want you to understand that I tried. I hired help. I kept the books, I did everything I had, watched him do my whole life." She looked at the table. "But there were things I didn't know. Things I hadn't been taught yet, because my father had expected to teach them to me over the next 20 years. A pause. "The man I hired to manage the hands was stealing from the operation. By the time I understood what was happening, the losses were too large." "You lost the land." "I lost the land." She said it without drama, just fact. 3 months ago, and then I had nowhere to go, which is exactly what my father said would be the condition under which I should bring the letter. Luke looked at her. She was tired in a way that went past the physical, the kind of tired that comes from fighting for a long time and losing anyway. But there was something beneath it that was not beaten. He had known enough broken people in his life to recognize the difference between a person who had been hurt and a person who had given up. Abigail Hayes had been hurt. She had not given up. "You traveled here alone." "I took a coach as far as Billings and walked the rest." "You walked from Billings." "I had money for the coach or the horse, not both." She met his eyes directly. "I chose the coach because the terrain between here and there is faster on foot than a slow horse in poor weather." Luke said nothing for a moment. "That's about 40 miles, he said. 37, she said. I measured. He opened the letter alone. He had asked her if she would give him a few minutes, and she had nodded without offense and taken her coffee to the chair by the window, and Luke had gone to his father's desk and sat in his father's chair and broken the wax seal carefully, because it was the last seal of his father's that would ever exist in the world, and he was not ready to destroy it carelessly. The letter was 3 pages in Samuel Mercer's handwriting, close and deliberate, every line pressed firmly into the page, the way his father wrote when something mattered. Luke. If Abigail Hayes has found her way to your door, then Robert Hayes has died, and his daughter has found herself without ground to stand on. I am going to ask you to give her some. I know that is not a small thing to ask. I know you do not know her name, and I know you are wondering why I never told you. I am going to explain as much of it as I can, and I am going to ask you to trust that whatever I cannot explain, I had reasons for. 25 years ago, I made a mistake that cost the Hayes family nearly everything they had. I am not going to explain the full nature of it in this letter, because some things are better spoken than written. What I will tell you is that I have spent 25 years trying to set it right quietly, because the alternative was a conversation I did not have the courage to have. Robert Hayes never knew it was me. He believed his luck had changed. I let him believe that because the truth would have hurt him in a different way than the original damage, and I was not willing to add that weight to his life. But I have thought about his daughter. She is a remarkable young woman, Luke. I have watched her from a distance, the way an old man watches the world when he knows his time in it is ending. She has her father's steadiness and her mother's fire, and she has something neither of them had, a kind of practical intelligence that cuts through nonsense the way a good knife cuts through rope. She does not need charity. She would refuse it. What she needs is a place where that intelligence has room to work. Your ranch needs someone like her more than it needs almost anything else right now, and I think you know that even if you won't say it. I am not asking you to do this for my sake, though. I will admit I am hoping you will. I am asking you to do it because it is right. Because she has earned a fighting chance, and no one has given her one. Trust her son. That is all I am asking. Trust her the way I trusted you with everything I ever built. Your father. Luke sat with the letter for a long time after he finished reading it. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals. Outside, the wind was moving through the pines at the north edge of the property with a sound like running water. He could hear the cattle shifting in the pasture, that low, constant sound that had been the background of his entire life. His father had kept a secret for 25 years. He did not know yet what the secret was. The letter had told him it existed, and promised an explanation that was now impossible to deliver. His father had spent decades quietly fixing something, and now the fix had walked 37 miles through a Montana autumn and knocked on Luke's door at midnight. He folded the letter carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope. He went back to the kitchen. Abigail looked up when he came back into the room. She had finished her coffee and was sitting with her hands in her lap, watching the dark window. She did not ask what the letter said. She waited. "My father says you're not looking for charity," Luke said. "I'm not. He says you'd refuse it. He was right about that." Luke pulled out the chair across from her and sat down again. "Then what are you looking for?" She considered this carefully. "Work," she said. "I can keep books. I can manage a household. I understand cattle operations well enough to be useful at the administrative level, though I won't claim to be a rancher. I can cook. I can nurse sick livestock in the early stages before a doctor is needed, and I learn quickly." She paused. "I am not asking for anything I haven't earned. I am asking for the opportunity to earn something. My father seemed to think you were worth the opportunity. Your father was a kind man." "He was a complicated man," Luke said. "Kind and complicated both." Something moved across her face at that recognition, maybe, or something adjacent to it. "Most good people are," she said quietly. Luke looked at her for a long moment. He thought about his father's desk and his father's handwriting and the seal that was now broken in his pocket, and he thought about the 37 miles she had walked because she had chosen the coach over the horse, and he thought about what his father had written. "Trust her the way I trusted you with everything I ever built. You can have the spare room off the kitchen," he said. "It's small, and it's cold at night until the stove warms it up. There are extra blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed." She looked at him steadily. "For how long?" "Until we figure out what comes next," he said. "That's the honest answer. I don't make promises I don't know how to keep." "That's fair," she said. That's more than fair. Dawn. She was up before dawn. Luke came down to find fresh coffee on the stove and a fire already built up, and Abigail at the kitchen table with his ranch ledger open in front of her. She looked up when he came in, and before he could say anything, she said, "I wasn't prying. The ledger was on the desk, and I wanted to see what I was working with." She paused. "You have a problem with your grain supplier." Luke poured himself coffee. "I know I have a problem with my grain supplier. He's been overcharging you for 6 months. The price per hundredweight doesn't match the regional average I've been tracking in my head from what I saw in Billings and along the road." She turned the ledger to face him and pointed to a line. "See this? This is what you paid in April. Look at this." She pointed to another line. "This is what you should have paid based on the notation here about the delivery weight." Luke looked. She was right. He had known the numbers felt wrong. He had not had the time or the energy since his father died to sit with them long enough to prove it. "The discrepancy across 6 months is significant," she said. "Enough to matter." "How did you spot that in—" He looked at the clock on the wall. 20 minutes. "I've been awake since 4, she said. "And I've spent 3 years keeping books for an operation that was trying to survive. You learn to see the wrong numbers faster than the right ones." Luke sat down with his coffee and looked at his ledger and felt something he hadn't felt in 6 months, the specific, uncomfortable sensation of realizing that someone in the room understood something better than he did, and that this was not a problem, but a solution. He hated it and was grateful for it at the same time. "All right," he said. "What else?" Ned. By the end of the first week, Abigail Hayes had reorganized the filing system that Samuel Mercer had maintained for 40 years, and that Luke had failed to maintain for 6 months. She had written 2 letters, one to the grain supplier and one to a competing supplier in the next county, and the resulting negotiation had saved the ranch a figure that made Luke sit very still when she presented it to him. She had also diagnosed a respiratory infection in 3 of the younger cattle before it spread isolated them, and begun a treatment protocol she had learned from a veterinarian who had worked their family ranch when she was a teenager. The ranch hands didn't know what to make of her. Callum Briggs, who had worked the Mercer Ranch for 11 years and considered himself the closest thing to a foreman that a man without the title could be, had watched Abigail for the first 3 days with an expression of extreme suspicion. On the 4th day, she had noticed that his saddle was wearing on the left side in a way that would cause it to slip under load, and she had told him so plainly, and he had checked it and found she was correct, and his suspicion had shifted into something more complex. "Where'd she come from?" he asked Luke on the 5th morning when Abigail was across the yard talking to one of the younger hands about the sick cattle. "My father sent her," Luke said. Callum looked at him with an expression that clearly wanted more than that. "That's all I have right now," Luke said. "She knows her way around an operation," Callum said finally. "I'll give her that." "She does. The boys are nervous around her." "They'll settle." "What about you?" Callum asked. "You settled." Luke watched Abigail across the yard. She was explaining something to the young hand Tom 19 and new this season, and she was using her hands as she talked, sketching something in the air, and Tom was nodding slowly in the way people nod when something is finally making sense. "Not yet," Luke said honestly. He read his father's letter again that night, and the night after that. The mystery of the secret at the center of it grew larger the more he thought about it, not smaller. What kind of mistake did a man spend 25 years repairing in secret? What had Samuel Mercer done to the Hayes family that he couldn't face telling anyone, including the son who had believed he knew his father completely? He did not ask Abigail. He wasn't sure she knew. The letter had said Robert Hayes had never been told the truth, that he had believed his luck had simply changed. If Robert had never known, Abigail would have no reason to know either. But his father had known. His father had carried it. Luke thought about the margins of the ledger, the careful, deliberate handwriting. The man who had filled a room with stories and history and the names of people he had known for decades. Samuel Mercer, who could talk about anything, who had talked about everything, had kept this particular thing absolutely silent for 25 years. The silence said more than anything else could have. On the 8th night, Luke came in from a late check on the cattle to find Abigail still at the table with the account books spread around her, and a cup of tea cooling at her elbow, and a focused expression on her face that did not shift when he came in. "You should sleep," he said. "I'm almost through the quarter records," she said. "I want to understand the full picture before winter. You don't have to do this tonight." She looked up then. "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to. This is—" She paused and something shifted in her expression, something more personal. "This is what I know how to do. Sitting with numbers until they make sense. It's the thing I'm best at." A pause. "It's also the thing my father taught me, and it's the thing I do when I need to feel like myself again." Luke stood in the doorway for a moment. "My father taught me to read cattle," he said. "By which I mean to just look at them. Stand at the fence and look. He said you could tell more about the health of an operation from watching cattle for an hour than you could from any set of numbers." He paused. "I used to think he was just being poetic." "Was he?" "No," Luke said. "He wasn't. He was right about most things." Abigail looked at him steadily. "Was he right about me?" she asked. "To send me here?" Luke was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I don't think he was wrong." The first real trouble came from outside the ranch, as most real trouble does. Victor Langford had the neighboring spread to the northeast 3 times the size of the Mercer operation, built on a combination of savvy land purchases and the particular willingness to be unpleasant that large landowners in Montana Territory sometimes treated as a business strategy. He had been friendly enough with Samuel Mercer in the way that 2 neighboring operations are friendly when one is larger and can afford to be magnanimous. He had been watching Luke since Samuel died with the patient interest of a man who suspects an opportunity may be developing. He rode over on a Wednesday morning unannounced, while Luke was in the south pasture, and Abigail was at the desk in the main house. Callum came to find Luke within the hour. "Langford's up at the house," he said. "He was asking about the woman." Luke straightened. What was he asking? Who she is, where she came from, how long she's staying. Callum's expression was careful. "I told him you'd need to answer that." Luke walked back to the house. Langford was standing in the yard rather than inside, which was either a courtesy or a calculation, and with Victor Langford, it was always difficult to tell which. He was 60 years old and built like a man who had done hard work for 40 of those years, and had not let the comfortable ones soften him entirely. He had a genial face that did not quite match his eyes. "Mercer," he said. "Good morning." "Langford?" Luke stopped a few feet away. "What brings you over? Neighborly visit." Langford smiled. "I heard you had a guest. Word travels." "Always does out here." Langford tilted his head toward the house. "Young woman. Arrived last week. Alone." He paused. "People are naturally curious." "People can be curious all they want," Luke said. "She's working the ranch." "Is she?" It wasn't a question exactly. "She is." Langford nodded slowly with the air of a man absorbing information and sorting it into categories. "You know her long." "Long enough," Luke said, which was technically true if misleading. "Where's she from?" "Eastern Montana. And she just showed up here looking for work." "She came with a reference," Luke said. "Whose reference?" "My father's." That landed with a small but noticeable effect. Langford's expression shifted not dramatically, but enough for Luke to catch it. Something behind the genial face recalculating. "Your father's been gone 6 months," Langford said. "He arranged it before he died," Luke said. "Now, if you have ranch business to discuss, I'm glad to talk. If you came over to ask about my household arrangements, I think we're finished." Langford looked at him for a moment. Then he smiled again, the same easy smile. "Just being neighborly," he said. "You need anything this winter, you know where to find me." He rode out. Luke stood and watched him go, and felt the particular unease of a man who has answered a question correctly and somehow still lost the conversation. That evening, he told Abigail about the visit. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He'll come back," she said. "Probably. And next time he'll have done more research." She looked at the window. "He'll find out who I am. That I lost my land. That I arrived here alone with nothing, and that I'm living in your house." She turned back to him. "That's a story that can be shaped into whatever a person wants it to be. What kind of story do you think he'll shape it into?" She met his eyes. "The kind where I'm here to take something that isn't mine." Luke said nothing. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that I understand how this looks. I have understood it from the moment I decided to come here. A young woman, with nothing, arriving at a widower's ranch with a letter from his dead father, is not a story that most people are going to receive charitably." She paused. "I came anyway, because I didn't have another choice, and because your father trusted me enough to give me one. But I want you to know that I understand what I've asked of your reputation, as well as your hospitality." Luke looked at her. He thought about 37 miles on foot. He thought about the ledger and Callum's saddle, and the sick cattle that weren't sick anymore, and the quiet, deliberate way she moved through the ranch as though she was already measuring what she could contribute, rather than what she could take. "I'll handle Langford," he said. "Luke." She said his name for the first time, and the directness of it stopped him. "He's going to say things. People are going to believe some of them. I need you to be ready for that before it happens, not after. Because after is when it becomes a problem." He looked at her. "All right," he said. "I'm ready." He wasn't entirely, but he had said it, and the act of saying it was its own kind of promise, and Luke Mercer did not make promises he wasn't prepared to keep. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall across the dark Montana Valley light, and exploratory testing the ground for what was coming. Inside, the fire in the stove held steady, and the ledger was open on the table, and somewhere beneath everything that had happened in the past 10 days was the slow, quiet, unmistakable feeling of a house beginning against all odds and against the long, cold weight of grief to wake up. But the waking up was only the beginning, and Luke Mercer, sitting across from a woman his dead father had trusted with his last and most important promise, had no idea. Yet how much of the story was still buried, or how hard it would shake him when it finally came into the light. The snow that had started falling the night Victor Langford rode away did not stop for 3 days. By the time it did, Abigail Hayes had made herself so quietly indispensable to the Mercer Ranch that even Callum Briggs, who had spent 11 years treating this operation as his own private domain, had stopped finding reasons to be in the main house when she was working and started finding reasons to be there instead. It wasn't dramatic. That was the thing Luke kept noticing. There was no moment where Abigail announced herself or demanded recognition. She simply moved through each problem the ranch had, the way water moves through cracks in stone, finding the weakness, applying pressure, and opening the way without any apparent effort. The grain supplier was the first to feel it. His name was Deacon Albright, and he had been overcharging the Mercer operation for 6 months, under the reasonable assumption that a grieving son with a struggling ranch and no head for administrative detail was not going to examine his invoices with any rigor. He had been correct about that assumption until the morning a letter arrived at his office, written in a precise, unfamiliar hand, detailing every discrepancy in his billing across 6 months, cross-referenced against regional pricing data, and concluding with a figure, the exact amount he owed back, followed by a deadline. He arrived at the Mercer Ranch 4 days later, which was 2 days before the deadline, and asked to speak to whoever had written the letter. Luke brought him into the kitchen where Abigail was working, and watched Deacon Albright's face go through several rapid adjustments when he realized the letter had come from a woman sitting at a kitchen table with an account book. "Miss Hayes," Albright said, with the particular tone men use when they are deciding how seriously to take a situation. "Mr. Albright?" Abigail did not look up from the page she was finishing. "Sit down." He sat down. He left 2 hours later, having agreed to repay the full amount and having signed a new contract at corrected rates for the following year. He also left with the expression of a man who had arrived expecting a negotiation and had received an education instead. Callum watched him ride out from the barn doorway. "She talked to him long?" he asked Luke. "Long enough." He signed. Callum said nothing for a moment. Then, with the careful economy of a man who did not give compliments carelessly, "Your father always said the numbers were what killed him. Said he could run cattle in his sleep, but the paperwork was going to put him in the ground before his time. He wasn't wrong. Seems like she's pretty good at the paperwork." "Seems like," Luke said. Callum looked at him sideways. "You trust her?" Luke was quiet for a moment longer than he intended. "I trust what she's done," he said. "The rest is still being determined." What she had done by the end of the third week was considerable. The account books were not just organized, they were annotated. Abigail had gone back through 5 years of Mercer Ranch financial records and built a picture of the operations patterns that Luke had never had, and his father had kept only in his own head. She had identified 3 separate areas where costs were being absorbed unnecessarily, and 2 where the operation was undercharging for services it provided to neighboring ranches. She had also quietly, and without making it a formal proposal, started teaching Tom, the 19-year-old hand, who had been on the ranch since September, how to track the health indicators of the cattle herd in a systematic way. Tom had no formal education, but he had an instinct for animals and a willingness to learn that Abigail had spotted faster than Luke had, and within 2 weeks, Tom was catching early warning signs in the herd that would previously have gone unnoticed until they became expensive. "How'd you know he'd be good at that?" Luke asked her one evening. "He listens," she said. "Most people watch when you're teaching them something. He listens. You can tell by where his eyes go, not at you at the thing you're describing. He's seeing it in his head while you talk." She paused. "That's the kind of mind that retains things." Luke thought about that. "My father used to say something like that. Different words." "What did he say?" "He said you could tell more about a man's future from watching what he pays attention to than from anything he tells you about himself." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like he was a careful observer," she said. "He was," Luke said. "About everything. He almost said, except the things he kept hidden. He didn't." The first real fracture happened on a Thursday 3.5 weeks after Abigail's arrival. It came from town, carried in by young Tom, who had ridden in for supplies, and come back with a look on his face that said he had heard something he didn't know how to deliver. Luke found him in the barn moving around a task with too much concentration for what the task actually required. Tom stopped. "Boss? What happened in town?" Tom looked at him, then at the ground, then at him again. "People are talking," he said, "about Miss Hayes." "What are they saying? That she showed up here with nothing, that she's living in the house." Tom's jaw tightened. "Some of them are saying she's here to work her way into the inheritance, that she found out about the ranch and made up a story about Mr. Samuel knowing her family." Luke was still. "Who's saying that?" "Couldn't tell you where it started," Tom said. "But it's around. It's in more than one place." He paused. "Mrs. Halstead at the dry goods said she felt sorry for you. Said it was a shame what a pretty face could do to a man who was grieving." Luke breathed carefully through his nose. "That's what she said?" "Yes, sir." "Thank you for telling me," Luke said. His voice was level. "Don't repeat it to Miss Hayes." "No, sir." He walked back to the house with the specific controlled fury of a man who knows that expressing his anger will only confirm what the town already believes it knows. He didn't tell Abigail. She found out anyway because Abigail Hayes had spent her life in small Montana communities and understood exactly how fast information moved through them. She came to him 2 days later in the late afternoon while he was reviewing the new supply contracts she had drafted. "You know what they're saying in town?" she said. It was not a question. He set the papers down. I know. I want you to understand that I expected it. I know you did. You told me so. I want you to understand that I can leave, she said. If my being here is causing damage that the work I'm doing can't offset, it's not. Luke. She waited until he looked at her. I'm not asking for reassurance. I'm asking for an honest assessment. Because if the cost to your reputation is higher than the value I'm providing, then your father's intent is being defeated by my presence, not served by it. He looked at her steadily. Do you believe what you're providing has value? I believe the numbers show it clearly. Then that's the honest assessment, he said. The numbers are what matter to this ranch, not Mrs. Halstead's opinion of what a pretty face can accomplish. Something crossed Abigail's expression. Not pleasure at the compliment, but something more complicated. Like a person who has received a form of honesty they weren't fully prepared for. All right, she said quietly. Then I'll stay. You'll stay. She picked up the stack of contracts and went back to the desk. Luke picked up his papers and stared at the same line for 10 minutes without reading it. Victor Langford came back on a Saturday. This time he came with his ranch manager, a heavy-set man named Pruitt, who had the look of someone whose primary function was to be large and present. It was a statement of intent, the kind of visit that was meant to look casual while being anything but. Luke met them in the yard. Mercer, Langford said. I was hoping we could talk. We can talk. Privately. Pruitt can wait with Callum, Luke said. Come inside. He brought Langford into the front room, not the kitchen where Abigail was working, and sat across from him with his hands on his knees and waited. Langford took his time getting to it. He talked about the winter, about the cattle market, about a fence line on the eastern boundary that they'd been meaning to address for 2 years. Luke answered each topic briefly and waited. Finally, Langford leaned back and said, I did some checking on your girl. She's not my girl, Luke said. She's an employee. Right, Langford nodded slowly. An employee who lives in your house and manages your finances and arrived from nowhere with a letter your dead father supposedly wrote. He paused. You know she lost her land. I know. Left under debt. I know that too. Langford's expression shifted into something that was trying to look like concern. Luke, I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because I knew your father and I'd feel wrong about not saying something. He paused again. A young woman with nothing and nowhere to go showing up with a convenient story about a dead man's promise that's a pattern that's been used before. Usually ends with someone losing something they can't get back. Luke looked at him. Victor, he said carefully. My father's handwriting is in that letter. I have been reading my father's handwriting my entire life. I know it the way I know my own voice. He paused. If you came here to suggest to me that Abigail Hayes forged a dead man's letter, I'd like you to say that clearly, so I know exactly what you're suggesting. Langford held up a hand. I'm not saying that. Then what are you saying? I'm saying that even if the letter is genuine, the situation it's created is irregular. He chose the word carefully. A young woman in a widower's house. People talk. People are already talking, I'm aware. It could damage you. Come spring when you're trying to negotiate grazing rights, when you're talking to the bank about the operational loan reputation matters. It does, Luke agreed. I could help, Langford said. If she were to move on, find another situation somewhere, I could help smooth things over. I have relationships in this county. What people are saying now doesn't have to follow you. Luke looked at him for a long, quiet moment. He thought about the grain supplier sitting at this kitchen table signing a corrected contract. He thought about 3 sick cattle that were now healthy. He thought about Tom, who was learning to see things he hadn't known existed 3 weeks ago. He thought about his father's ledger margins and 5 years of financial patterns assembled into a picture that was finally making sense. Victor, he said, I appreciate the neighborly concern. He stood up. But I think we're finished here. Chetier. Langford did not look pleased when he left. Pruitt followed him out with the heavy-footed patience of someone accustomed to waiting for outcomes he didn't influence. Luke watched them ride out and then stood for a moment with his hand on the doorframe. Callum appeared beside him. What did he want? To help, Luke said dryly. Callum snorted. He wants the land, Luke said. He's been watching this operation since my father died, and he wants to see if it fails. And if you run the woman off, it's more likely to fail. Luke looked at him. I've been running books on this ranch for 11 years, Callum said mildly. I know what the numbers looked like before she got here and what they look like now. Langford's smarter than he acts. He'd know that too. Luke thought about that for a moment. So keeping her here is good for the ranch, he said. Keeping her here, Callum said, is the best decision you've made since you let me hire Tom. That night, Abigail found an error in the cattle registry that had been compounding for 3 years. She came to Luke with the registry open and a piece of paper where she had done the calculation 3 times to be sure, and she set it on the table in front of him without preamble. Your branded count is off, she said, by 14 head. Luke stared at the paper. Off how? Off in the registry. Your actual count based on the pasture logs Callum keeps is higher than what's recorded officially. She sat down. That means either there's been a recording error for 3 years or cattle that should have been registered weren't, Luke said slowly. Or cattle that were registered were sold off the books and replaced with unregistered animals, and no one noticed because the pasture count stayed approximately the same. She paused. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm telling you what the numbers suggest. Luke was very still. Who had access to the registry? Anyone who worked the ranch in the past 3 years, she said carefully. I'm not in a position to narrow it further without more information than I have. But someone has been. The numbers suggest it, yes. Luke stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there long enough that Abigail behind him did not speak. She understood that silence sometimes needed room. My father didn't catch it, he said finally. Your father was ill the last 2 of those 3 years, she said quietly. The registry records from that period are in a different hand, not his. She paused. Luke, this isn't a reflection on him. He turned around. Whose handwriting? She looked at him steadily. You'd know better than I would. He crossed the room and looked at the registry page she had marked. He looked at the handwriting. He knew it. He had seen it on delivery receipts and supply orders, and 100 different ranch documents over the past decade. He knew it the way you know handwriting you've seen every day for years without ever examining it closely. His stomach dropped. I need to talk to Callum, he said. Luke? Abigail's hand touched his arm, brief, firm, immediately withdrawn. Be careful. You're about to accuse a man who has worked here 11 years. If you're wrong, you won't recover it. If you're right, you need to be certain before you speak. He looked at her hand already gone from his arm. What would you do? He asked. I would count the cattle, she said. Physically, methodically, one by one. I would reconcile the physical count against the registry and the pasture logs. I would do it myself without telling anyone why, and I would have the number in my hand before I said a word to anyone. She paused. Give me 2 days. You'll count 1,500 head of cattle in 2 days. I'll count what we need to count to prove the discrepancy, she said. It won't take the whole herd. Give me 2 days. He gave her 2 days. She took one. She came to him on the second morning with a final number written cleanly on a single piece of paper and set it in front of him. The discrepancy was not 14 head. It was 22. And attached to the paper was a second sheet, a timeline she had constructed from the pasture logs and the registry entries and the dated supply receipts that showed exactly when each discrepancy had occurred. 3 of them fell in a 2-week window, when Luke had been away from the ranch for his father's final weeks in a Billings hospital. Luke sat with the papers for a long time. Callum knew I was gone, he said. Everyone did, Abigail said. That doesn't mean Callum did this. The handwriting. The handwriting is consistent with Callum's, that's all I can tell you. Consistent with is not proof. Luke looked up at her. But you think it's him. She held his gaze. I think the evidence points in his direction. I also think you need more than what I've given you before you do anything irreversible. She paused. There is one more thing you could look at. What? The accounts Callum maintains separately from yours. He keeps a personal ledger. I've seen it on his desk in the foreman's quarters. I haven't looked at it. I wouldn't without your direction. Luke was quiet. Are you asking me to direct you to look at it? I'm telling you it exists, she said simply. What you do with that information is your decision. He stood. He sat back down. He ran his hand across his jaw and stared at the table. My father trusted him, he said. I know. 11 years. I know. If this is real. He stopped. If this is real, my father's operation was being stolen from him while he was dying. While he was in a hospital bed and couldn't see what was happening to what he'd spent his life building. The words came out with more force than he'd intended. The grief at the center of them was raw and immediate, and had nothing to do with 22 missing cattle. Abigail did not look away from him. Then we find out if it's real, she said. And if it is, we fix it. That's what your father would have done. You didn't know my father. No, she said. But I know what he wrote about this ranch. And I know what a man sounds like when he loves something enough to protect it even past his own death. She paused. He knew this place needed someone to fight for it. That's why he sent me. The room was very quiet. Luke looked at her. Really looked at her the way he hadn't permitted himself to look since the first night when she had pressed that envelope against his chest with both hands, and he had felt the weight of something that had traveled a very long distance to reach him. She was not soft. That was the thing he kept coming back to. She was not soft, and she was not easy, and she was not performing any kind of helplessness to make him feel necessary. She was simply there, clear-eyed, and steady, and absolutely committed to the problem in front of her, and the effect of it, after 6 months of trying to hold a grief-heavy ranch together alone, was something he didn't have a word for yet. He found one later lying awake at 3 in the morning, while the cattle settled and the fire ticked down. Safe. That was the word. For the first time since his father died, something in this house felt safe. He did not know what to do with that. Callum brought it to him first. That was the thing that Luke had not anticipated. He had spent 3 days preparing for a confrontation, building the case in his head, reviewing Abigail's timeline, asking himself what his father would say. And on the 4th morning, before he had said a word, Callum walked into the main house at 7 in the morning, took off his hat, sat down at the kitchen table and said, I need to tell you something. Abigail was there. She did not leave. She set her coffee down and sat very still, and did not look at Callum at all, which was its own kind of grace. I sold cattle, Callum said. He said it directly looking at Luke, not at the table. 22, head over the past 3 years. I kept the money. I told myself I'd pay it back. He paused. I didn't pay it back. Luke looked at him. Why? He said. My wife's family. Callum's voice was controlled and absolutely miserable. Her mother needed a surgery, the kind you pay for before they'll do it. I didn't have the money and I couldn't borrow enough and He stopped. I told myself it was a loan, from the operation, that I'd replace the cattle come spring. You didn't replace them. No, because then Clara needed something else, and then her brother lost his own place and needed... He stopped again. It kept being the thing I'd fix next year. Luke was silent for a long time. You should have asked me, he said finally. Callum looked up. You should have come to me and told me what was happening and asked me to help. That's what you should have done. Callum's jaw worked. I know that. My father would have helped you. I would have helped you. I know. Instead, you stole from an operation my father built with 40 years of his life while he was dying in a hospital and couldn't see what was happening. The words were not loud. They were worse for not being loud. Callum put his hat on the table and looked at it. Yes, he said. That's what I did. The kitchen was so quiet that the sound of the fire in the stove was the loudest thing in it. Luke looked at Abigail. She was looking at him, not at Callum, not at the table. At him. Waiting. He thought about his father's letter. Trust her the way I trusted you with everything I ever built. He thought about the way the ranch had felt 6 months ago, and the way it felt now. He thought about Callum's hands in winter, working in the cold every day for 11 years without once saying it was beneath him. He thought about Clara Briggs, who brought a pie every Christmas, and whose name Callum said the way a man says the name of the thing he'd burn everything else to protect. You'll repay it, Luke said. Every head or the equivalent in cash at fair market value. I'll set a schedule that's workable. Callum looked up. And you'll tell me, Luke continued. From now on, whatever it is, whatever's happening with Clara or her family or anything else, you tell me and we figure it out together. You don't take it. Luke, do you understand what I'm saying? Callum's throat moved. Yes, he said. I understand. Good. Luke picked up his coffee. Then go check the south fence line. Tom said it was showing wear at the post nearest the creek. Callum put his hat back on and walked out. At the door he stopped, and without turning around he said, She found it, didn't she? Does it matter how? Luke said. A pause. No, Callum said. No, I suppose it doesn't. He went out. Abigail said nothing for a long time after the door closed. Luke drank his coffee. The fire in the stove crackled and settled. That was a generous decision, she said finally. It was the right one. They're sometimes the same thing. My father would have done the same, Luke said. Probably. He had a talent for separating what a man did from what kind of man he was. That's a rare talent. He was a rare man. Luke set his coffee down. I'm beginning to think you two would have gotten along. Abigail was quiet for a moment. I think we might have, she said softly. I hope so. Outside the temperature had dropped again, and the sky had the white, pressurized look of a Montana winter gathering itself for something serious. But inside the Mercer Ranch kitchen with the account books open and the corrected contracts filed, and 22 cattle now officially documented in the repayment agreement Abigail would draft before noon, something had shifted in the weight the walls were holding. Not fixed, not finished, but moving. Victor Langford was still out there watching and calculating. The rumors in town had not died. They had only changed shape, the way rumors do, when the first story doesn't accomplish what it was designed to accomplish. And beneath everything buried in the history, his father had never spoken aloud, was the original secret, the one the letter had promised to explain, and couldn't, the one that had sent Abigail Hayes 37 miles through a Montana autumn toward a door she had no guarantee would open. That secret was still buried, but the ground above it was no longer quite as still as it had been. And somewhere in the neighboring spread to the northeast, Victor Langford had gotten hold of something. Luke didn't know what yet, but a man like Langford didn't ride over twice out of neighborly concern. He rode over when he thought he had leverage, and the second time he had not found the leverage he was looking for in Luke's face. He would look somewhere else, and whatever he found there was going to change everything. Victor Langford found the journal on a Tuesday. Luke didn't know that yet. He was in the north pasture when it happened, checking fence line with Tom while Callum worked the supply inventory that Abigail had reorganized into a system. Even a man with Callum's particular relationship to paperwork could navigate without losing his place. The ranch was running with a precision it hadn't had in years, possibly ever, and Luke had spent the past week doing the specific, uncomfortable work of admitting to himself that his father had been right. Samuel Mercer had sent Abigail Hayes here because the ranch needed her. What Luke had not yet fully admitted to himself or anyone else was that he was beginning to suspect the ranch was not the only thing. He came back from the north pasture at midday to find Tom waiting for him at the barn with a look that had become familiar over the past several weeks, the look of someone who had heard something in town and was deciding how to deliver it. Just say it, Luke said, swinging down from the saddle. Langford's been at the land registry office, Tom said. Spent 2 hours there yesterday. Then he went to see Reverend Caulfield. Luke stilled. "The Reverend." "Yes, sir." "What business would Langford have with Reverend Caulfield?" "Couldn't say for certain." Tom took the reins from him. "But the Reverend keeps the old parish records. Birth records, death records, property transfers that ran through the church back when the county wasn't organized enough to keep its own registry." He paused. "Going back 30-40 years." Luke stood very still in the cold air. 30 years. His father had said 25 years in the letter. 25 years ago, Samuel Mercer had made a mistake that cost the Hayes family nearly everything they had. Whatever that mistake was, whatever had happened between Samuel Mercer and Robert Hayes in the years before Luke was old enough to understand anything, it was old enough to live in the church records, and Langford had just gone looking for it. "How do you know all this?" Luke asked. "My cousin works at the land registry," Tom said simply. "Langford's not quiet when he thinks no one important is listening." Luke took that in. He thought about Abigail inside the house right now, working at a desk that had been his father's building a future for a ranch on top of a past she knew nothing about. "Don't say anything to Miss Hayes," he said. "No, sir." He walked to the house with the particular controlled pace of a man who does not want to be seen moving fast. He went to his father's study that night after Abigail had gone to her room, and he went through the desk with a methodical thoroughness he had avoided for 6 months, because going through his father's desk meant accepting in a physical and final way that his father was not coming back to it. He found ledgers, correspondence, legal documents, the careful paper archaeology of a man who had built something from nothing over 40 years. He found letters from lawyers, letters from banks, letters from cattle brokers in Billings and Chicago. He found a photograph of his mother. He had not known existed, young and laughing at something outside the frame, and he set it aside and kept moving because if he stopped, he would not start again. He found the journal in the bottom drawer beneath a false floor he had not known was there. It was not hidden carelessly. His father had constructed the false bottom deliberately cut and fitted and stained to match the rest of the drawer so precisely that Luke only found it because he was looking for exactly this kind of thing. A man who hides something doesn't hide it unless it matters. And a man like Samuel Mercer, methodical, deliberate, a man who chose every word he wrote with the weight of someone who understood that words outlive the people who wrote them, did not build a false bottom in a drawer for something trivial. The journal was old. The cover was worn to a pale softness at the corners, and the spine had been repaired at least once with a strip of leather that didn't quite match. Luke opened it to the first page. His father's handwriting, young and less controlled than the version Luke had grown up reading, looser. Faster, the handwriting of a man who was recording things urgently rather than carefully. The date at the top of the first entry was 26 years ago. Luke had been 12 years old. He started reading. He read for 2 hours without moving. The journal was not a daily record. His father had not been the kind of man who wrote about weather and meals and the ordinary passage of days. He wrote when something was pressing against him hard enough that it needed to go somewhere outside his own head, and what pressed against Samuel Mercer in those pages was a single event described from every angle his father could find, returned to again and again across entries that spanned the better part of a year. 26 years ago, Samuel Mercer had been running cattle across open range in a season when water was scarce, and every rancher in the territory was pushing their herds toward the same creek systems. He had made a decision, not a malicious decision, not even a careless one by the standards of the time, to redirect a tributary that ran through his eastern property to better serve his own herd during a drought. The redirection was legal. It was within his rights. It was the kind of thing ranchers did. What he had not fully understood was how far downstream the effects would travel. Robert Hayes's ranch sat 4 miles to the east. The tributary before Samuel's redirection had fed a secondary water source that Hayes depended on for the eastern third of his operation. When that source dried up, not overnight, but over the course of a summer, gradually enough that by the time Hayes understood what was happening, the damage was already done. The results were catastrophic. Hayes lost 2/3 of his eastern herd to dehydration and the secondary infections that followed. The cattle he had planned to sell that autumn to pay his land note were gone. The note came due. He could not pay it. Samuel had not known. That was what the early journal entries showed: a man genuinely unaware of what his legal, reasonable decision had caused 4 miles downstream. He had heard through the ordinary channels of ranch country gossip that Hayes was in trouble, and he had not connected it to himself, until he rode east to check a fence line and found Robert Hayes in his own pasture, standing among dead cattle, a man who had been quietly destroyed by something he could not understand or explain. Samuel Mercer had understood in that moment. He had done the mathematics instantly and completely, standing at that fence line, looking at what his redirected water had cost a man who had done nothing to deserve it. He had not said a word. That was what the journal said. I stood at that fence, and I looked at what I had done, and I did not say a word. I told myself it was because speaking wouldn't fix it. I told myself the right thing was to make it right quietly. But the truth, and I am writing this because I need to say the truth somewhere, even if I cannot say it to anyone, the truth is that I was afraid. I was afraid of what he would do. I was afraid of what the county would say. I was afraid that everything I had built would be undone by a single admission. I chose my ranch over his family. I told myself I would fix it without that cost. I have spent 20 years wondering whether I was wrong. He had fixed it. That part was also in the journal. Anonymously, carefully, through intermediaries and arrangements that had cost him significantly. Over the years, the land note paid through a lawyer who would not reveal his client. The cattle restocked through a sale that appeared to be at market price, but was subsidized from Samuel's own pocket, ongoing small assists whenever Hayes hit a hard season. He had watched Robert Hayes rebuild what had been taken from him, and had told himself, in the careful accounting of a guilty man, that the debt was being repaid. But he had never said it. He had never looked Robert Hayes in the face and said, "I am the reason your cattle died. I am the reason you almost lost your land. I fixed it because it was the only way I could live with what I did not, because it absolved me." He had carried it for 26 years. And then he had gotten sick, and he had looked at what he was leaving behind, and he had thought about Abigail Hayes, a young woman he had been watching from a careful distance, the daughter of the man he had wronged. And he had written a letter, and sealed it, and told her to bring it to his son, if she ever had nowhere else to go. The last entry in the journal was dated 4 months before Samuel Mercer died. I have made arrangements for Abigail. I have not told her everything. I could not find the way to say it. But Luke will find this journal because I know my son. He doesn't leave things unfinished, he never has, and he will understand what I couldn't bring myself to write in the letter. This is my full accounting. Not a confession, because the man I wronged is dead, and my confession would only burden the living. This is an explanation. For Luke, who deserved better than a father who kept secrets. And for Abigail, who deserved better than a life shaped by consequences she never knew were coming. I loved Robert Hayes the way you love someone you've wronged beyond fixing. I never told him. I never told anyone. That is my great failure. All the rest, the ranch, the cattle, the years of work, those I managed well enough. But this I failed. I am sorry, son, for what I did, for not telling you sooner, for asking you to carry this now that I no longer can. Luke closed the journal. He sat in his father's chair at his father's desk with his father's secret in his hands, and outside the window, the Montana night was absolute and cold and indifferent to everything that had just changed inside that room. He didn't sleep. By 4 a.m, he had read 3 of the journal entries twice and was sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee when he heard Abigail's door open. She appeared in the kitchen doorway and stopped when she saw him taking in his face and the journal on the table, and the untouched coffee, with the rapid, accurate assessment that was so characteristically hers that even now, even in this, he noticed it. "Something happened," she said. "Sit down, Abigail." She sat. He looked at her across the table, at this woman who had walked 37 miles to deliver a dead man's letter, who had rebuilt his financial records and diagnosed his cattle and exposed theft and faced down rumors without flinching. And he felt something that was grief and anger and a terrible, disorienting tenderness all at the same time. "My father kept a journal," he said. "I found it tonight." She waited. There's something in it about your family, he said. About your father. The stillness that came over her face was the stillness of a person who has been expecting a blow and is bracing without showing it. Tell me, she said. He told her. He was careful and thorough, because she deserved both, and he did not soften it in the places where it needed to be hard, and he watched her face as he spoke with the specific attention of a man who knows that what he's saying is going to change something that cannot be changed back. She did not interrupt. She sat with her hands flat on the table, the same posture he had found himself in again and again in this house, pressing against something solid to stay present. And she listened to every word. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet. He redirected the water, she said finally. Not a question. Processing. Yes. And my father's cattle died because of it. Yes. And Samuel knew. He understood what he'd done. He understood immediately. At the fence line. She breathed. One breath, deliberate and controlled. And he spent 25 years paying it back without ever telling anyone. Without ever telling your father. Yes. She looked at the journal on the table. My father died without knowing. Yes. He spent his whole life grateful to a man whose name he didn't know, she said. A man he thought had simply been kind, who he thought had done it out of generosity. She paused. He talked about that stranger until the day he died. He said it was proof that the world had more good in it than it showed on the surface. Another pause longer. He based his whole faith in people on a man who was actually trying to erase a debt. Luke said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. Did your father love my father? She asked. The question was strange and direct and completely sincere. I think he did, Luke said slowly. In the way the journal describes it, yes. He watched your family. He cared what happened to you. He made sure the damage he caused was repaired every time it threatened to resurface. He paused. Whether that's love or guilt is a question I don't know how to answer. It can be both, she said quietly. Yes. It can. She sat with that for a long time. Luke let her. The fire in the stove needed feeding, and he didn't move to feed it. Some moments required staying in them. He sent me here, she said finally, knowing I'd find out eventually. I think he sent you here and left the journal so that I would find it and tell you because he couldn't find a way to write it in the letter. Luke's voice was careful. He was trying to be honest without being there to absorb the consequences of the honesty. That's a coward's honesty, she said. Yes, Luke agreed. It is. She looked at him then. You're not defending him. He was my father, and I loved him. That doesn't make what he did right. He held her gaze. He built something good out of a wrong he committed. He provided for your family across 25 years in ways your father never knew. He made sure you had somewhere to go when you had nothing left. He paused. And he did all of it while being afraid, which doesn't make it noble. It just makes it human. Abigail was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, I need some air. And she stood and went to the door and went outside into the Montana dark, and Luke sat at the table and let her go, because she was entitled to whatever she needed to do with this, and none of it was his to manage. She was outside for 20 minutes. When she came back in, her eyes were red, but her face was composed. She sat back down at the table. She picked up her coffee mug, found it empty, and set it back down. I'm not leaving, she said. Luke looked up. I want to be clear about that before anything else. Her voice was steady. What I just learned changes the history. It doesn't change what's here. This ranch is real. What I've done here is real. What your father gave both our families damaged and complicated as it was is real. She paused. I'm not leaving. I didn't ask you to. No, but you were thinking about whether you should ask me to. He had been. He admitted it without speaking, which she read the way she read everything accurately. Why would I ask you to leave? He said. Because the reason I'm here is more complicated than either of us knew. Because your father sent me as an act of guilt as much as generosity. Because some people, when they find out the foundation of something was built on a fault line, prefer to walk away from the whole structure rather than repair it. She looked at him levelly. You're not that kind of person, but I wanted to name it anyway. You're right that I'm not that kind of person, he said. I know. How do you know? Because of Callum, she said. What you did with Callum is how I know. A man who is going to walk away from a compromised foundation doesn't give an 11-year employee a repayment schedule and tell him to come to you next time. She paused. You're your father's son. All the best parts of him. Luke felt that land somewhere it shouldn't. Somewhere he hadn't been letting things land. And the rest, he said. The parts that kept secrets for 25 years. I don't see those in you, she said. I see a man who couldn't even keep the grain suppliers overcharging secret once I showed him the numbers. Despite everything, despite the cold kitchen and the unread journal and the grief that had cracked open again, he almost smiled. That's a low bar, he said. It's a real one, she said. Langford moved 3 days later. He came into town on a Friday morning and called an informal meeting at the feed store, the kind of informal meeting that functions as a formal announcement when a man with Langford's resources and reach is the one convening it. He brought 2 things: a copy of a document from the church records and a carefully constructed version of what it meant. Luke heard about it from Tom by noon. He's telling people your father caused the Hayes family's losses 20-some years ago, Tom said. That Samuel Mercer damaged their operation deliberately and paid it back in secret to avoid accountability. Deliberately, Luke said. That's the word he used. He has a document, a water rights record from the church registry, shows the redirection your father filed. Tom paused. He's saying the woman your father sent here is the daughter of his victim, that she's come to claim what her family was owed. Luke was still. What are people saying? Mixed. Tom looked uncomfortable. Some of them are saying it makes the woman look better, not worse, like she's owed something. Some of them are saying it proves she came here with an angle. And some of them... He stopped. Some of them, what? Some of them are saying your father was a fraud, that his whole reputation was built on top of what he did to that family. The anger that moved through Luke at that was specific and clean and cold. Not the hot, expansive anger of a man who doesn't know what he's feeling. The precise, narrow anger of a man who knows exactly what has been said and exactly why it's wrong. Where is Langford now? He said. Rode back to his place after the meeting. Good. Luke turned. Where's Abigail? Main house. She doesn't know yet. She will, Luke said, before someone else tells her. He told her directly the way she had told him things clearly, without softening the edges that needed to stay hard. She listened with that particular stillness of hers, and when he finished, she said, deliberately. That's the word he chose. He doesn't have evidence of intent. He has evidence of action. I know. What he's doing is taking a fact and building a story around it that serves his purposes. She paused. The fact is true. The story is a lie. Yes. She stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment, and he watched her shoulders and the set of her spine and understood that she was working through something rather than breaking under something. There was a difference, and he had learned to read it. He wants the ranch, she said. Yes. If your father's reputation is destroyed, the support you have in this county erodes. The bank relationships, the grazing agreements, the informal networks your family has built for 40 years, they all depend on how Samuel Mercer is remembered. She turned around. And if I'm characterized as someone who came here to claim what my family was owed, then my presence here validates the narrative that you're being manipulated. She paused. He's very smart. He is. What are you going to do? Luke looked at her. What are we going to do? He said. That's the question. She held his gaze for a moment, and something in her face shifted not dramatically, but in the way of a person recognizing that a pronoun has changed and understanding what the change means. "All right," she said. "What are we going to do?" They went to see Reverend Caulfield. Luke had known the Reverend since childhood, a small, precise man who had married his parents and buried his mother, and who treated information with the particular care of someone who understood that words spoken from a position of authority had consequences. He received Luke and Abigail in his office on Saturday morning and listened to what Luke had to say without interrupting. When Luke finished, the Reverend looked at Abigail. "You're Robert Hayes's daughter," he said. "I am. I knew your father, not well, but I knew him." He paused. "He was a good man." "He was," she said. "And you knew none of this, about Samuel Mercer's involvement." "Not until 2 days ago." The Reverend looked at his desk. "Victor Langford came here on a Tuesday," he said. "He asked to see the water rights records. I had no legal grounds to refuse him." He looked up. "I want you to know that I did not offer him interpretation. I gave him the record and nothing else." "I know," Luke said. "He provided his own interpretation. He provided a dishonest interpretation of an honest document." The Reverend's voice was precise and unhappy. "Your father made a legal decision that had unintended consequences. He spent 25 years correcting those consequences at personal cost. That is not the biography of a fraudulent man. That is the biography of a man who made a mistake and spent the rest of his life trying to be worthy of it." "Can you say that?" Luke asked. "Publicly, in the way that matters in this county." The Reverend looked at him for a long moment. "I can say what I know," he said. "What I know is that Samuel Mercer made anonymous contributions to the Hayes family that I was asked to facilitate on 2 separate occasions. I know because he came to me for help with the arrangements, and he asked for my confidence, which I have kept until this moment." He paused. "I kept his secret because he asked me to. I will not keep it any longer if it is being used to damage him." Luke felt something release in his chest that had been tight for 3 days. "Thank you," he said. The Reverend looked at Abigail. "Miss Hayes, I am sorry for what you have learned this week, both for the loss it represents and for the complexity it has put in the place of something simpler." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "The simpler version wasn't entirely true," she said. "I'd rather have the complicated truth than a comfortable story." The Reverend looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has just confirmed a judgment he had already made. "You are very like your father," he said. She looked at him, and for the first time since Luke had told her the contents of the journal, something in her face that had been carefully held together showed the edge of what was underneath. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was barely even. The following Wednesday, Victor Langford received a visit. Not from Luke. Luke had considered it and decided against it because a confrontation between 2 men with competing claims to a county's regard would only produce theater, and theater was what Langford wanted. Instead, Langford received a visit from Reverend Caulfield, who arrived at the Langford spread on Wednesday morning and sat across from Victor Langford in his front room and said quietly and specifically what he intended to say publicly if Langford continued his current course. Luke didn't know exactly what was said. He knew the outcome by Thursday. The version of events circulating in town had begun to shift. Not completely, not quickly, but the word deliberately had been quietly withdrawn from Langford's account of things, replaced by unintentionally, and the story had moved from fraud to mistake, which was the truth, which was enough. It was not a victory. It was a correction. Luke understood the difference. What he did not understand, could not have predicted, was what happened that same Thursday evening. He was coming in from the barn when he heard voices from the kitchen. Not alarming voices, but voices when he had expected silence, Abigail's and another one he didn't immediately place. He came into the kitchen to find Abigail sitting across from a woman he recognized after a moment as Ellen Pruitt, wife of Langford's ranch manager. She was a small, sharp-faced woman in her 50s who Luke had encountered perhaps 3 times in his life at county events. She was sitting at his kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, and she was speaking in a low, rapid voice that stopped when Luke came in. Both women looked at him. "Mr. Mercer," Ellen Pruitt said. She had the posture of a person who has done something she wasn't sure she should have done and is committed to it anyway. "Mrs. Pruitt," he said. "I came to speak to Miss Hayes," she said. "I hope that's not an imposition." Luke looked at Abigail. "Sit down," Abigail said to him. "She has something you need to hear." He sat. Ellen Pruitt looked at the table, and then at him, and then at Abigail, and then she said, "My husband works for Victor Langford. He does his job, and he does it well, and I'm not here to speak against him." She paused. "But I know what Victor has been doing these past weeks, and I know why. And there's a part of it that I think you don't know yet." "Tell me," Luke said. "Victor Langford has been in correspondence with your bank," she said. "He has been suggesting to the bank manager that the Mercer Ranch is operating under circumstances that represent a financial risk, a disputed legacy claim, potential legal challenges from the Hayes family, reputational damage to the operation." She looked at him steadily. "He has been building a case that the ranch is a poor credit risk, so that when your operational loan comes up for renewal in spring, the bank will decline it." The kitchen was absolutely quiet. "If the bank declines the loan," Luke said slowly, "you can't make it through the next cattle year without it," she said. "Not at the scale you're operating. You'd have to sell off significant acreage to cover operating costs." "And Langford would buy it," Abigail said. Her voice was flat and clean as a blade. "He's already drafted a purchase offer," Ellen Pruitt said. "I've seen the document on his desk." Luke sat with that for a moment. The full architecture of it assembled itself in his mind with a clarity that was almost admirable. Langford had identified the point of maximum pressure and been working toward it methodically since the first morning he'd ridden over. The rumors, the church records, the version of Samuel's history he'd been spreading, none of it had been about reputation. It had all been about the bank. "Why are you telling us this?" Abigail asked. She was not unkind, she was direct. Ellen Pruitt looked at her hands. "Because my husband knows what Victor has been doing and hasn't stopped it," she said. "And I've been a part of things that were wrong before by not speaking. I don't intend to do it again." She paused. "And because what I heard about your father, about what Samuel Mercer did, and what he spent 25 years doing to fix it." She looked at Abigail. "My own family had a hard season once, a long time ago. Someone helped us, and we never knew who. I've always thought about that." She stopped. "I don't know if it was Samuel Mercer, but it might have been." Abigail looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," she said, "for coming." Ellen Pruitt stood, nodded, and went to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. "Miss Hayes," she said, "whatever they're saying in town, I think you should stay." Then she was gone. In the quiet, she left behind Luke, and Abigail sat across from each other at the kitchen table, where everything in the past 3 weeks had been decided, and looked at the shape of what they were facing. "The bank," he said. "We have until spring," she said. "That's enough time." "To do what?" "To make the numbers so strong that no characterization Langford offers is going to outweigh them." She was already thinking he could see it, that rapid, organized precision moving behind her eyes. "Your cattle inventory, properly documented and registered, is an asset the bank will weigh. The corrected supplier contracts represent ongoing savings. The operational efficiencies from the past month projected forward." She paused. "I can build a loan renewal case that makes this ranch look like the best credit risk in the county. I've done it before for an operation that was actually failing. I can certainly do it for one that is genuinely recovering. You can do that." "I can do that," she said. "But Luke?" She paused. She looked at him with something that was more personal than the financial analysis, something that had been building through everything, through the journal, and the Reverend and Ellen Pruitt, and all the days before them. "I need you to understand something." "What?" "I came here because your father sent me. That's true. And I've stayed because there was work to do and I could do it. That's also true. She held his gaze. But the reason I am going to fight for this ranch against Langford, against the bank, against every version of the story he's been building, is not because of what your father owed my family, or what I owe yours. She stopped. It's because this place has become... She stopped again. She looked down at the table. Real, she said finally. It's become real to me, the people in it, the work, the... She didn't finish the sentence. Luke looked at her. At the precise, careful, endlessly competent woman who had walked 37 miles through a Montana autumn and sat down at his father's desk and rebuilt what grief had allowed to fall apart, and who was now sitting across from him in the kitchen where everything important had happened, telling him something in unfinished sentences because some things were too new and too fragile for complete ones. Abigail, he said. She looked up. I know, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Something passed between them that was not a declaration and was not a question, and was both of those things simultaneously the way some true things resist being any single one thing. Then she picked up her pencil and pulled the account book toward her and said, We have a lot of work to do before spring. We do, he said. He pulled his chair around to her side of the table. She didn't say anything about that. She simply shifted the account book so they could both see it, and they began. Outside, the night pressed in cold and certain against the walls of the Mercer Ranch and somewhere to the northeast. Victor Langford sat in his comfortable house with his drafted purchase offer and his bank correspondence and his careful architecture of damage, not yet knowing that the woman he had underestimated and the man he had tried to isolate were sitting at a kitchen table together in the lamplight, shoulder to shoulder building something he had not factored into his calculations, something that was going to be very difficult to stop. But Langford was not the only problem waiting on the other side of that night. Because Abigail had not yet told Luke the one thing she had not told anyone, the thing she had discovered in the county land records 3 days ago. The thing that changed the shape of everything she thought she understood about why she had no land left to go back to. And when that came out, and it would come out because the truth always did, in the end, it was going to shake the ground under both of them in a way that no account book could prepare for. She had found it 3 days before Ellen Pruitt came to the kitchen. The county land records office was not a place Abigail had intended to visit. She had gone into town to file the corrected cattle registry documents, the official paperwork resolving the discrepancy she had uncovered, signed by Luke and notarized and ready for the county clerk. And while she was waiting for the clerk to process the filing, she had done what she always did in any administrative space. She had looked at what was available. The index ledger for land transfers in the county sat open on the counter. It was the kind of document that officials left in plain sight because most people found it uninteresting. Abigail did not find it uninteresting. She found it the way a person with her particular mind always found organized information as a text worth reading. She had not been looking for anything specific. She had found something specific anyway. The Hayes family, land her father's land, the land she had lost, the land that the failed operation and the accumulated debt had forced her to surrender, had been transferred out of her name 8 months ago. She knew that. She had signed the transfer documents herself in a lawyer's office in eastern Montana with the specific numb efficiency of a person doing what has to be done. What she had not known was who had bought it. The transfer record listed the purchasing party as a landholding company operating out of Billings. She had not questioned this at the time because she had not been in a condition to question anything at the time, and because the lawyer had told her the company was a routine land investment operation, and she had believed him because she had needed to believe something was routine. The name of the holding company was Meridian Land and Cattle. She had looked at that name for a long moment. Then she had gone to the adjacent ledger, the one that listed corporate land holdings by parent company, and she had looked up Meridian Land and Cattle. The parent company was registered to a Victor Langford. She had stood at that counter for what must have been several minutes, because the clerk had eventually asked if she was all right, and she had said yes, and she had thanked him for the filing, and she had walked out into the Montana cold and stood in the street and understood the full shape of what had been done to her. Langford had bought her family's land, Not opportunistically, not after hearing it was available and making an offer. The timeline in the records was specific. The initial contact from Meridian Land and Cattle to her father's estate had come 2 weeks after her father's death, before she had even finished burying him, before she had fully understood the state of the debts or the operation. Someone had moved very fast with specific knowledge of her situation, made an offer through a lawyer who had advised her to accept it, and walked away with Hayes land at a price that was legal and was not fair. She had been maneuvered out of her land by the same man who was now trying to maneuver Luke out of his. She had sat on this for 3 days. She had sat on it through Ellen Pruitt's visit, through the conversation that followed, through 2 evenings of sitting at the kitchen table with Luke working the bank renewal case. She had sat on it because she needed to understand it completely before she said it, and because some part of her, the part that was still learning that this place was real, that the people in it were real, that she was not alone in the way she had been alone for the past 8 months, was afraid of what it would look like when she said it. It would look like she had been hiding something. Because she had been hiding something. She told him on Friday morning. She waited until Callum and Tom had gone out to the south pasture, until the ranch was quiet enough that she could hear the fire in the stove and her own breathing and nothing else. Then she set her coffee down and looked at Luke across the table and said, "I need to tell you something. I should have told you 3 days ago." He set his coffee down. She told him about the land records. She told him about Meridian Land and Cattle, about the timeline, about the lawyer who had advised her to accept the offer, about what the parent company registration meant. She told him all of it in the direct sequential way she told everything, and she watched his face move through the information. When she finished, he was quiet. "Langford bought your family's land," he said. "Yes." "Before you came here?" "Yes, 2 weeks after my father died." "And the lawyer who advised you to accept the offer?" "I don't know if he was working for Langford directly," she said. "I can't prove that. But the speed of the offer and the price it was made at—" She paused. It wasn't a coincidence. Luke looked at the table. "Why didn't you tell me 3 days ago?" She had been ready for the question. She had been asking it of herself. "Because I had just spent 2 days dealing with what you found in your father's journal," she said. "And I was aware that adding this, that I had been specifically targeted, that my losses were not simply the result of poor luck and my own inexperience, but that someone had positioned himself to benefit from my father's death. I was aware that it would look like I had been withholding a material fact about my situation from the moment I arrived here." "Had you been?" "No." She held his gaze directly. "I didn't know. I genuinely didn't know until I saw the transfer record. But I understand why it might not look that way." Luke looked at her for a long time. "Did you think I'd send you away?" he said. "If you told me—" The question landed in a place she hadn't expected. "I thought you might question everything," she said, "about why I came, about whether my arrival here was as innocent as I've presented it." "Was it?" "Yes." No hesitation. "I came because I had nowhere to go, and your father had given me a letter, and I had $23 and the clothes I was wearing. There was no strategy. There was no plan beyond survival." She paused. "Langford acted against me before I knew he existed. I didn't come here running from him. I came here running from the consequences of what he'd done without knowing he'd done it." Luke was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "All right." She blinked. "All right. All right, I believe you." He picked up his coffee. "And this changes what we're doing with the bank case." She stared at him. "That's all you have to say?" "What else would I say? Luke, I just told you that the man trying to destroy your operation is the same man who maneuvered me out of my family's land. That my presence here is that Langford has personal reasons to remove me specifically beyond just his interest in acquiring your acreage. That I've been at the center of this from before I ever knocked on your door." "I heard you," he said calmly. "And you're not—" "Abigail." He set his coffee down and looked at her with an expression that was patient and direct, and would not be moved. "You walked 37 miles to deliver a dead man's letter. You have spent 6 weeks rebuilding what grief and theft and bad luck had damaged here. You have faced down rumors and Langford and whatever it cost you personally to read that journal and keep going. You have told me this difficult thing this morning when you could have kept it to yourself." He paused. "What exactly would you like me to be angry about?" She looked at him. She didn't have an answer. "Now," he said, "tell me everything you remember about the lawyer who handled the sale. His name, his office, what he looked like, what he said. Because if Langford's company used fraudulent representation to acquire your family's land, that's not just a wrong to be noted. That's a legal matter." Harshad. The lawyer's name was Gareth Sims, and he operated out of a small office in the same eastern Montana town where the Hayes land had been registered. Abigail remembered him clearly, a precise, thin-lipped man who had come to her within the week of her father's death with a sympathy that had felt practiced, carrying an offer that he had described as timely and generous given the state of the estate. She had been 25 years old, recently orphaned, exhausted from months of watching her father die, and looking at a debt load that she had not yet fully understood. Sims had explained the offer in terms that made acceptance seem like the responsible choice. He had not lied to her, not technically, not in any way she could have identified at the time. He had simply framed everything so that the picture of her options looked a certain way. She wrote down everything she remembered. Luke read it. "I need to send some letters," he said. "To whom?" "The county attorney in eastern Montana, and a lawyer in Billings I've used for ranch business, a man named Aldrich, who has no connection to Langford." He paused. What Sims did may or may not be actionable, but Langford used a company to conceal his identity in that transaction, and there are laws about disclosure when a represented party has a conflict of interest. He looked at her. "It's worth finding out." Abigail looked at him. "Luke, even if we pursue this, it will take months, possibly years. The immediate problem is the bank." "I know. We pursue both. The legal challenge will cost—" "I know what it will cost." His voice was quiet and absolutely certain. "Your father's land was taken from you by deception by the same man who is now using your presence here as a weapon against this ranch. That is not something I'm going to note and move past." He looked at her steadily. "My father spent 25 years trying to repair what he did to your family. I am not going to sit here and watch what remains of that family be treated as a resource to be managed and let it go, because the timing is inconvenient." She was quiet for a long moment. "You sound like him," she said softly. "When you say things like that." "Like my father. Like someone who has decided something and is not going to be argued out of it by practical considerations." "Is that a criticism?" "No," she said. "It's not." The letters went out that afternoon. Callum rode them to the post office himself because Luke asked him to, and because Callum Briggs, whatever his failures was, a man who understood that being trusted with something important after having broken trust was not a small thing and was not to be handled carelessly. While the letters traveled, the bank work continued. Abigail built the loan renewal case the way she built everything methodically, thoroughly, with a precision that left no room for interpretation. She quantified the operational improvements of the past 6 weeks in terms that a bank manager could hold in his hands and compare against a projection, reduced supply costs, recovered cattle value, improved herd health indicators. The resolved registry discrepancy that had been quietly bleeding value from the operation for 3 years. She built a 5-year projection based on the corrected cost structure and the new supplier contracts and the management improvements that were now embedded in how the ranch ran. Luke reviewed every page. He asked questions. He pushed back on 2 projections he thought were too conservative, and she recalculated them and found he was right on one, and defended her position on the other until he conceded the point. It was the particular productive friction of 2 people who both understood what they were looking at and were not interested in being agreed with for the sake of agreement. Tom watched this from the doorway one evening and retreated before either of them noticed him. He mentioned it to Callum the next morning. Callum said, "Mind your work. which was his way of confirming that he had noticed the same thing a long time ago. The bank meeting was scheduled for the second week of January. Luke requested it himself, which was not the standard procedure. Typically, the bank initiated the loan renewal discussion. By requesting it early, he removed the possibility of being caught in a reactive position, and he arrived at the Mercer County Bank on a Tuesday morning with a folder of documents that Abigail had assembled, and a clarity of purpose that the bank manager, a cautious man named Hargreaves, had not expected from a rancher, whose operation he had been hearing concerning things about. Luke set the folder on Hargreaves's desk and said, "I'd like to go through this with you." Hargreaves looked at the folder. He looked at Luke. "I've had some correspondence," he said carefully, expressing concerns about the operation. "I know," Luke said. "From Victor Langford." Hargreaves was quiet. "What Langford told you," Luke said, "was that there's a disputed legacy claim against the Mercer Ranch. There isn't. What he told you was that there's potential legal action from the Hayes family. There isn't. Abigail Hayes is employed by this ranch and has no adversarial claim against it. What he told you was that the operation is in reputational difficulty that represents a financial risk." He paused. "I'd like to show you the actual financial picture." He opened the folder and began. 40 minutes later, Hargreaves had asked 11 questions, received 11 complete answers, and was looking at a 5-year projection that was conservative, documented, and credible. "The improvements over the past 6 weeks are significant," Hargreaves said slowly. "They are." "Who prepared this analysis?" "Abigail Hayes." Hargreaves looked at the folder. "The same woman Langford suggested was a risk to the operation. The same woman," Luke said, "who identified a 6-month billing discrepancy from the grain supplier, resolved a 3-year cattle registry irregularity, restructured the supply contracts, and built what you're holding in your hands." He paused. "You can assess the quality of the work directly. It doesn't require you to take my word for anything." Hargreaves looked at the projection for another moment. "The loan will be renewed," he said. "Standard terms." Luke nodded. "Thank you." "Tell Miss Hayes," Hargreaves said with the particular dryness of a man who is being precise, "that this is impressive work." He told her in the kitchen that evening. She received the news with a quiet exhale that was the closest thing to open relief he had seen from her. She who absorbed difficulty with such stillness that her moments of release were brief and physical and quickly contained. "Standard terms," she said. "Standard terms." She nodded. She looked at the table. Then she looked up. "Langford is going to know by morning," she said. "Yes." "He'll look for another angle." "He'll try." "Luke." She said his name the way she had learned to say it, directly, as a signal that what followed was important. "What happens now? With Langford, with the land records, with all of it? What does the end of this look like to you?" He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about things. "The legal letters will come back with an assessment in 4 to 6 weeks, he said. "If Aldrich thinks there's a case for fraudulent representation in the Hayes land sale, we pursue it. That process is long and uncertain, but it exists." He paused. "In the meantime, Langford has lost the bank angle. The Reverend has corrected the public account of my father. The ranch books are clean and documented. He has less leverage than he had a month ago, and he knows it." "That doesn't make him harmless?" she said. "No," Luke agreed. "Cornered men are the least harmless kind." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what happens after Langford, after the legal process, after the bank renewal is settled, and the season turns." "What about it?" She looked at the table. "I don't have a claim here," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm an employee. What I've built here is built on your land with your assets, and the value I've added belongs to the operation, not to me personally." She paused. "I want to know what you see when you look at the next year. Whether there's a place in it for—" She stopped. "Whether the role I have here is something you see as permanent or temporary." It was, he understood, an entirely practical question. She was asking it in practical terms because practical terms were the container she trusted most for things that were not entirely practical. He looked at her. "Abigail," he said, "the ranch hands stopped calling you the woman 2 weeks ago." She waited. "Tom calls you Miss Hayes when he's being formal, and Abby when he forgets to be formal, which is most of the time. Callum defers to your judgment on anything financial without being asked. The grain supplier sends correspondence addressed to you directly." He paused. "The role you have here is not something I think of as temporary. It stopped being temporary before I knew it had started." She looked at him with an expression that was working very hard to stay composed. "That's not exactly an answer to what I asked," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." He got up from the table. He went to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, and she let him the way he had let her stand outside in the cold 3 weeks ago with something too large for the kitchen. "My father's letter said I couldn't build a real home alone," he said. She was very still behind him. "He was right about most things," Luke said. "I've been resisting that particular truth longer than most." He turned around. "I don't make declarations. I don't have the language for them. What I have is—" He paused. "What I have is this. The ranch is not what it was before you came. I am not who I was before you came. And when I picture next year and the year after that, and whatever years come after those—" He stopped. "You're in them," he said simply. "That's the honest answer. You're in them." The kitchen was absolutely quiet. Abigail looked at him with the particular expression of a person who has been carefully managing a very large thing for a very long time and has just been given permission to set it down. "All right," she said. Her voice was uneven in a way that she didn't try to correct. "All right," he said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she picked up her pencil, and he sat back down, and they went back to the work shoulder to shoulder in the lamplight, and nothing had been formally declared, and everything had been understood, and that was exactly the right amount for two people who trusted plain truth more than grand language. The letter from Aldrich arrived on a Thursday 19 days after Luke had sent it. Abigail was in the barn with Tom when Luke read it at the kitchen table. He read it twice. Then he went to find her. She saw his face when he came into the barn, and she handed Tom the rope she was holding and walked to Luke and said, "Tell me." "Aldrich thinks there's a case," he said. "He says the non-disclosure of Langford's identity in the purchase transaction, combined with Sims's representation of the estate, without disclosing his relationship with the purchasing party, constitutes fraudulent misrepresentation under Montana territorial law." He paused. "He says the remedy would be rescission of the sale, return of the property to you with damages." Abigail stood very still. "Return of the property," she said. "If the case succeeds, he's careful about that. He says it's not certain, but he thinks the evidence is strong enough to pursue." She looked at him. "My father's land," she said. Yes, something moved across her face that he had not seen before. Something that was not the composed, precise Abigail Hayes, who managed everything with steady intelligence, but the 25-year-old girl who had buried her father and signed papers in a lawyer's office and walked away from 2 generations of her family's work because she had no other choice. "Luke," she said. Her voice broke on his name. "I know," he said. He did something then that was not planned and was not declared and was entirely natural. He put his arms around her and she let him, and they stood in the barn doorway with Tom tactfully and immediately finding business at the far end of the barn, and the particular grief and relief of what had just been said moved through her and was not hidden. She pulled back after a moment. She wiped her face with the back of her hand with the brisk, unsentimental practicality that was so completely hers that he almost smiled. "How long will it take?" she said. "Aldrich estimates 6 to 12 months for a full proceeding. And Langford will fight it." "He will. He has more resources than us." "He has more money," she said. "That's not the same as more resources." Her eyes were still bright, but her voice was already clear. "I know that land. I know every record attached to it going back 2 generations. I know the transaction documents better than any lawyer Langford hires will know them because I was there." She paused. "If Aldrich takes this case, he'll have the best prepared client in the history of that jurisdiction." Luke looked at her. "I don't doubt it," he said.
Chapter 5.
The confrontation with Langford came on a Saturday. Luke had not sought it. Langford came to him, rode up to the Mercer Ranch on a February morning with Pruitt behind him, and the particular expression of a man who has received bad news and has decided to respond to it with aggression rather than recalibration. Luke came out to the yard. "I heard you went to the bank," Langford said. "I did. And you sent lawyers after me." "I sent a lawyer after a fraudulent land transaction," Luke said. "If that happens to involve you, then the involvement is yours, not mine." Langford's expression hardened. "I bought that land legally." "You bought that land through a company that concealed your identity from a seller whose estate was being represented by a lawyer with a prior relationship to your interests," Luke said. "Aldrich can go over the specifics with your attorney. I'd rather not stand in the cold doing it." "You're making an enemy," Langford said. "You made yourself an enemy," Luke said, "when you rode over here the first time and tried to convince me to send away a woman who had done nothing to you because her presence was inconvenient to your plans for my land." He paused. "I don't know how long you've been watching this operation. I don't know exactly when you decided it was going to fail and you were going to be positioned to buy it. But I know you've been working toward it since my father died, and I know what you did to Abigail Hayes's family, and I know what you tried to do to mine." Langford looked at him. Something in his expression shifted the aggression still there, but beneath it, something more calculating and less certain. "That woman has turned you against your own county," he said. "That woman," Luke said, "has rebuilt what grief and theft were taking from me. She has done it with more competence and more integrity than anyone I've ever watched work, and she has done it while you in this county have been doing your level best to push her out." His voice was level and absolutely cold. "She stays. This ranch stands, and whatever legal process follows from the Hayes land transaction follows on its own merits." He paused. "Now get off my property." Langford sat his horse for a long moment. He looked at Luke with the expression of a man recalculating something, not surrendering but revising the plan, moving pieces in a new direction. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Luke agreed. "It isn't. But the part where you win is." Langford turned his horse. Pruitt followed. They rode out without looking back. Callum appeared at Luke's shoulder. "That go the way you wanted?" he asked. "Mostly," Luke said. "He'll be back." "Not today." Callum was quiet for a moment. "I've been meaning to say something." "Say it." "About Miss Hayes." Callum looked at the gate where Langford had gone through. "I was wrong about her, early on. I thought she was trouble, and I showed it." "You did?" Luke said. "She never called me on it." "No. Most people would have." "She's not most people." Callum nodded slowly. "No," he said. "She's not." He paused. "Your father would have liked her." "I think he did," Luke said. "From a distance, for a long time." Callum looked at him. "And you?" Luke watched the gate where Langford's dust was settling back to earth. "From a shorter distance," he said. "And getting shorter." Callum made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one, and went back to his work. Neb. That evening, Luke found the envelope. Not the envelope Abigail had carried across 37 miles of Montana, autumn pressed against his chest at midnight. A different one. He found it while pulling a chair away from his father's desk to make room for the new filing system Abigail had installed in the study. It had been wedged between the back of the drawer and the false bottom. He had already found in a gap so small that he had missed it the first time. It was smaller than the other envelope. Not sealed. His name on the front in his father's handwriting, but younger. The looser, faster script of the journal, not the careful, deliberate print of the letter that had brought Abigail here. He stood at the desk for a moment. Then he called down the hall. "Abigail!" She appeared in the doorway. He held up the envelope. She looked at it. She came into the room and stood beside him and said, "Open it." He opened it. Inside was a single folded page. He unfolded it. His father's handwriting, the journal version urgent, pressed hard into the page. He read it. He read it twice. Then he held it so she could read it too. She read it in silence. When she finished, she did not speak immediately. She stood beside him at his father's desk and held the edge of the page and breathed. The letter said, "Letter, son. If you found this, you found the other one first, and the journal, and Abigail. Which means things have gone the way I hoped they would, or at least not the way I feared. I want to tell you the thing I didn't put in the letter, because the letter was for both of you to understand eventually, and this is only for you. I didn't send her to you because I owed her family. I owed her family long before I thought of sending her to you. The debt was 25 years old and as settled as I could make it. That's not why. I sent her because I watched you after your mother died, and I watched you after Caroline left, and I watched you this past year when you didn't know I was watching, and I saw what loneliness does to a man who is built for more than it. I saw what loneliness was doing to you. And I had watched Abigail Hayes for 3 years, from the careful distance of an old guilty man, and I knew what she was. I knew what she could do. I knew what kind of person walks through that much loss and keeps walking. The ranch needed her. That was true. But Luke, you needed her more. I am not asking you to do anything with that. You'll do what you do. You always have. But I wanted you to know that I saw it. And I wanted you to know that whatever you build from here, whether it's the ranch or something larger or something I couldn't have predicted, I built everything I built so that you'd have something worth building on. That was always the point. Your father. Luke stood at the desk for a long time. Abigail stood beside him, close enough that he was aware of her shoulder near his arm, the specific warmth of someone standing very near in a room that had been cold and solitary for a very long time. "He knew," she said quietly. "He knew," Luke said. "He was betting on both of us." He was. She looked at the letter in his hands. "He was right," she said, plainly without drama, the way she said everything true. Luke looked at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the letter, and her profile was exactly as it had been on the first night, composed, clear, carrying something enormous with the steadiness of a person who has learned to carry enormous things. He reached out and took her hand. She looked down at his hand over hers. She turned her palm and held it. They stood like that at his father's desk in the room where the journal had been hidden, and the secret had been buried, and the false bottom had concealed the letter that had finally said what everything else had been building toward. And the ranch settled around them, the cattle moving in the pasture, the fire in the stove, pushing warmth through the floorboards, Callum's lantern swinging through the barn across the yard, and all of it felt for the first time since Samuel Mercer had drawn his last breath like it was exactly where it was supposed to be. Not because a dead man's promise had been kept, because two people who had both been standing at the edge of their own separate darknesses had found in the particular unlikely way that life sometimes arranges these things the same light. Outside, the Montana winter held everything in its cold, patient grip. But inside the Mercer Ranch study, with a father's last letter folded on the desk between them, the long season of waiting was over. The hand-holding lasted exactly 4 seconds. Not because either of them wanted it to end, but because Tom knocked on the study door at that precise moment to say that one of the young heifers was showing signs of early labor 3 weeks ahead of schedule, and Abigail pulled her hand back and said, "I'll get my coat," before Luke had finished processing the interruption, and that was that the moment folded itself away into the ongoing life of the ranch, the way moments do when the ranch decides it needs something. Luke stood at his father's desk for another 3 seconds after she left the room. Then he put the letter carefully in the inside pocket of his jacket against his chest and went to deal with the heifer. The calf arrived at 2 in the morning, small and loud and insistently alive. Abigail had stayed the full time talking to Tom in low, practical tones, doing the specific, unglamorous work that a difficult birth required. And when it was over, she had looked at the calf with the expression of someone who had needed, without knowing it, to watch something come into the world successfully. Tom had gone to clean up. Luke had stood beside her at the stall door. "She'll be all right?" Abigail asked. "Both of them will," he said. "Tom did good work. You taught him well." "You taught him to pay attention," Luke said. "I just gave him something worth paying attention to." She looked at him sideways. "That's a generous revision of history." "It's accurate." She almost smiled. Almost. The kind of almost that was its own full thing. They walked back to the house in the cold dark without speaking, and the silence was not empty. It was the specific full silence of two people who have said something true and are letting it settle before they say anything else, and both of them understood it that way. February moved into March with the particular stubbornness of Montana winters that know they're losing but refuse to admit it cleanly. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, then from the flat ground around the barn, and the cattle moved differently, a restlessness that Tom could read now, that shift of energy that meant the season was turning, and the animals knew it before the calendar did. The ranch was unrecognizable from what it had been in October. Not in its physical form. The buildings were the same, the land was the same, the fence lines that Callum maintained with the stubborn pride of a man who knew he was paying a debt through his work, followed the same routes they always had. What had changed was the way the operation breathed. There was a rhythm to it now that had been absent, a coordination between the accounts and the pasture management and the supply chain and the people moving through all of it that made the whole thing feel intentional rather than reactive. Abigail had done that. Not alone. Nothing was done alone on a ranch, but she had been the intelligence that connected everything, the mind that looked at the full picture, rather than only the part directly in front of it. Luke thought about this on a Tuesday morning in early March while he was going over the spring planting schedule, and realized he was thinking about it the way he thought about the fence lines and the water sources and the cattle as a fixed and essential feature of the landscape. She had become a fixed feature of his landscape. He was not surprised by this. He had watched it happen with the specific awareness of a man who notices a thing clearly and is not yet ready to do anything about it, which is its own kind of cowardice and its own kind of patience simultaneously. His father's second letter had changed something, not created it. It was already there, had been there since a midnight knock, and a dead man's envelope, and 37 miles on foot through a Montana autumn. But the letter had named it, and named things could not be unnamed. The legal letter from Aldrich arrived on a Wednesday. Abigail was at the desk when Luke came in with it. He set it in front of her without a word, and she looked at his face first, reading him before the paper as she always did, and then she picked it up and read it. She read it twice, which was unlike her. She set it down. "He wants to settle," she said. "Yes." Langford's attorneys had contacted Aldrich. They were not admitting liability. They were offering a financial settlement, a figure that was significant, that accounted for the estimated value of the Hayes land and the losses from the original forced sale, plus additional compensation described in the letter as relating to distress caused by the transaction, not the land itself. Money, not land. The Hayes property had already been subdivided and partially leased, and returning it in its original form was Aldrich's letter noted carefully, potentially achievable through the courts, but would be a longer and more contested process than accepting the settlement. Abigail looked at the number on the page. "It's enough to buy comparable land," she said. "I know. Not the same land, but enough to start again. Aldrich says comparable acreage in the Eastern District is available. He's attached a listing." Luke paused. "He also says if you want to fight for the original parcel, he'll fight it. He thinks the case is strong. It will take longer, and the outcome is less certain, but it's possible." She sat with both options for a long moment. "What do you think?" she asked. It was the question she asked when she trusted someone's judgment alongside her own. He had noticed when she started asking it. He had not said anything about noticing. "I think the land your father worked is not the same land it was," he said carefully. "Langford's leasing arrangements have changed it. The relationships you'd have with neighbors there after a legal fight, those would be shaped by the fight." He paused. I think you could build something new on comparable land without carrying that weight. You think I should settle? I think you should do what feels right, he said. But if you're asking what I think, yes. She looked at the letter. All right, she said. I'll settle. She said it without drama, the way she made every significant decision clearly once, without looking back. Luke picked up the letter to send Aldrich the response. Luke, she said. He looked at her. With that money, she said, and then she stopped. She looked at her hands on the table. What I want to do with that money, I want to talk to you about it before I decide anything. All right, he said. I'm listening. She looked up. Not now, she said. Tonight, when there's time to do it properly. He nodded. He went to send the letter. He spent the rest of the day with the specific, distracted awareness of a man who has been told that an important conversation is coming and cannot stop anticipating it. That evening after supper, after Tom had gone to the bunkhouse, and Callum had turned in early the way he'd been doing since his wife Clara had come to stay for a week, a visit Abigail had quietly arranged by mentioning to Callum that the spring cleaning of the main house would be easier with another woman present, which was a fiction they had all agreed to maintain. Luke and Abigail sat at the kitchen table with the fire settled into its evening rhythm and the account books closed for once. She had her coffee. He had his. I want to invest it, she said. In the ranch. He was quiet. Not as a loan, she said immediately, reading his expression. Not as something you owe me back. As a... She paused, choosing the word carefully. As a stake. A stake, he said. A formal share in the operation. Documented legal proportional to the investment. She held his gaze. I don't want to be an employee here, Luke. I want to be a partner. The word landed with a weight that both of them felt, and neither of them acknowledged directly, because the word partner in the context of a ranch operation and the word partner in the context of two people who had been holding hands in a study 3 weeks ago and had not spoken of it since, were the same word doing two different kinds of work simultaneously. What would the investment cover? He said. The eastern water infrastructure needs replacing. I've been looking at the cost, and it's significant. The spring cattle purchase could be larger if the capital was there, and the projected return justifies the investment. She slid a page across the table. I've run the numbers 3 ways. This is the conservative case. He looked at the page. He looked at her. You've been planning this, he said. Since January, she said. When I knew the settlement was possible. She paused. I want to build something here. I've been building it since October without a formal stake in it. I'd like to correct that. You'd be tying yourself to this land, he said. Yes. To this operation. Yes. He looked at her steadily. Abigail, are we talking about the ranch? She held his gaze for a moment that was long enough to be its own answer. We're talking about the ranch, she said carefully. And about whatever the ranch is part of, which I believe we've both understood for some time. She paused. I'm not a woman who waits for things to be said if they can be done. I would rather hold a share of this land than have a conversation about feelings. That is the most practical declaration I've ever heard, he said. Something crossed her face, not quite a smile, but built from the same materials. I'm a practical person, she said. You are, he agreed. He pulled the page toward him and looked at the numbers with the full attention they deserved, and when he had looked at them properly, he said, The eastern water infrastructure figure is accurate. The cattle purchase projection is slightly optimistic but defensible, and the conservative case understates the return by about 12% based on what the spring market has been doing. I thought you might say that, she said. Here's the moderate case. She slid another page across. He looked at it. We'll need Aldrich to draft the partnership agreement, he said. I've already written to him, she said. He'll have a draft ready when the settlement is finalized. Luke looked at her. You were confident I'd say yes, he said. I was confident the numbers would say yes, she said. And I've learned that you follow the numbers. He set the page down. He looked at her across the table, across all the evenings they had sat at this table, across everything that had been decided here, and discovered here, and survived here. And he said, "I don't follow the numbers, Abigail. I follow what's right. The numbers are just how I show my work." She looked at him with that expression, the one she couldn't fully contain, the one that was more than composed competence, more than clear intelligence, the one that was the actual Abigail Hayes underneath all the things she had learned to present to a world that had not always been safe. "All right," she said softly. "Then yes." "Yes," he agreed. Sin. The settlement was finalized in the third week of March. Gareth Sims lost his legal license 6 weeks after that as a result of the complaint Aldrich filed with the territorial bar on Abigail's behalf. That outcome had not been part of the original case, and had not been sought for its own sake. But Aldrich had noted the ethical violations and pursued them because they were there, and because a lawyer who manipulates grieving clients on behalf of concealed buyers should not continue to practice law. Langford did not come back to the Mercer Ranch. He was still in the county. He still had his spread and his cattle and his influence, and those things did not evaporate because a legal settlement and a bank renewal had gone against him. But he had revised his calculations. A man who had spent 40 years acquiring things understood when a thing was not acquirable, and the Mercer Ranch, with its rebuilt books and its corrected registry and its bank relationship and its new spring cattle and its formal partnership agreement filed at the county clerk, was not a thing he was going to acquire. He understood something else too, though he would not have admitted it. He understood that he had underestimated Abigail Hayes from the first moment he'd heard about her, and that this underestimation had cost him more than the legal fees. It had cost him the patience of the county, which watched what had happened with the careful interest of communities that depend on the integrity of their own institutions and do not forgive those who corrupt them. Reverend Caulfield preached a sermon in April that did not mention any names and did not need to. The partnership agreement was signed on a Thursday morning in Aldrich's Billings office. Aldrich was a broad, unhurried man who had been practicing law in Montana for 30 years and who had the particular quality of people who have seen enough human complexity to stop being surprised by it. He witnessed the signing without comment, shook both their hands, and said as they were leaving, "Your father would be pleased, Mr. Mercer." Luke paused at the door. "Did you know him?" "We met once," Aldrich said. "He consulted me about a matter I couldn't help him with at the time. I always thought he was a man carrying something heavy." He paused. "He looks lighter in the telling of what's happened since." Luke held the door for Abigail. They rode back from Billings, with the signed agreement in Abigail's satchel, the same leather satchel she had been carrying on the night she knocked the one that had held 37 miles of Montana autumn, and a sealed letter and everything she owned. It had better contents now. They didn't talk much on the ride back. They didn't need to. The particular companionship that develops between people who have worked through something large together does not require conversation to exist. It exists in the way two people occupy a shared silence, the ease of it, the lack of anything that needs filling. They were an hour from the ranch when Abigail said, "I've been thinking about the eastern parcel. The one that borders Callum's fence repair project. If we redirect the secondary feed through the new water line, the grazing rotation could shift to include it through July. We'd get another 2 months of use from it before the dry season." Luke thought about the geography. "You'd need to address the fence on the north side first." "I know. I've already asked Tom to assess it." He looked at her profile against the Montana sky, the same profile he had watched on the first night in lamplight, pressing an envelope against his chest. 26 weeks ago. He had been a man sitting alone at his father's desk, pressing his hands against the wood to stay present in the world, and she had been a woman who had walked 37 miles on faith and a sealed letter, and neither of them had known what they were walking into. "Abigail," he said. "The fence will take a week at most," she said, still looking at the road. "Tom's faster than he was in October." "Abigail." She looked at him. He said, "I need to say something that isn't about the ranch." She was quiet. The wagon moved. The road ahead was empty. "All right," she said. He thought about his father's letters, both of them. He thought about the language his father had used and the language that had always felt too large for his own mouth, too formal for the way he actually understood things. He thought about what she had said at the kitchen table. "I'm not a woman who waits for things to be said if they can be done. I'd like to marry you," he said, "if you're willing." The wagon kept moving. She looked at the road for a moment. "That's not very romantic," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not. You could have said it better." "I could have," he said. "I'm better with numbers." She turned to look at him fully. Her expression was doing the thing it always did when she was containing something that composed surface, with the actual thing visible just underneath bright and real and refusing to be entirely managed. "Ask me properly," she said. He took a breath. "Abigail Hayes," he said, and his voice was steadier than he'd expected. "You walked 37 miles to knock on my door in October, and you have not stopped moving since, and I have watched you rebuild everything that was broken here, including some things I didn't know were broken. And I love you in a way that I don't have better words for, except that when I think about this ranch and this life and whatever comes after all of it, you are already there in all of it, and you have been for a long time." He paused. "Will you marry me?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said, plainly, once, the way she said every true thing. And then she picked up the reins she had been holding and clicked the horses forward and said, "The fence on the north parcel really does need to come first." And he laughed. Actually. Laughed a real sound, the kind that hadn't come from him since before his father got sick, and she smiled with her whole face. Finally, not the almost smile that was its own full thing, but the actual one, the one that changed everything. It touched, and they rode back to the Mercer Ranch in the late afternoon of a March day, with the partnership agreement in her satchel, and something better than a legal document between them. "Mo." They told the ranch hands at supper. Tom put his fork down and stared for 3 seconds and then said, "Finally," with such feeling that Callum looked at him sharply, and then Callum looked at Luke and then at Abigail, and his expression went through several complicated adjustments before arriving at something that was for Callum Briggs remarkably close to open warmth. "Your father," he said to Luke. "He arranged this." "He tried to," Luke said. "We did the rest." Clara Briggs, who had extended her visit for another week and showed no signs of ending it, stood up and embraced Abigail without asking permission, and Abigail, who did not typically receive unsolicited embraces with ease, held on for a moment before stepping back. "He'd have loved you," Clara said. "Samuel. He'd have loved you completely." "I think he did," Abigail said. "From a distance." "Not anymore," Clara said firmly, and sat back down, and that was that. The wedding was in May, when the Montana land was doing the thing it only did for a few weeks each year, brief and extravagant and impossible to take for granted. Reverend Caulfield performed the ceremony in the yard of the Mercer Ranch, which was not the church, but was more fitting. The people who came were not many. The ranch hands, Clara and Callum Ellen Pruitt, who arrived alone and stood at the back with the quiet dignity of a woman who knew her own cost for being there and considered it worth paying a few families from the county who had decided early that the version of events Langford had been selling was not the version they were buying. Abigail wore her mother's brooch, pinned to a dress that Clara had helped her alter, and she walked to the ceremony from the house door without anyone on her arm because there was no one to give her away, and she would not have been given. In any case, she arrived on her own terms, the way she had arrived at everything, and stood next to Luke with her hands steady and her eyes clear. He looked at her and saw everything. She was the 37 miles and the account books and the sick cattle and the confrontations she had not flinched from and the grief she had carried and the intelligence she had given without reservation and the hand she had held in the study for 4 seconds before a heifer went into early labor. She looked at him and saw what she had not let herself fully name until she was standing here saying it in front of witnesses' home. Not the land she had lost, not her father's land or her mother's land or any parcel on any deed. Home as a condition of being with a specific person in a specific place that had chosen you back. Reverend Caulfield asked his questions. They gave their answers. The Mercer Ranch hands cheered with the particular enthusiastic volume of people who have been watching something build for months and are relieved to finally be allowed to acknowledge it. Callum did not cheer. He stood with his hat in his hands and his jaw working and his eyes bright. And when Luke looked at him across the yard, he gave a single nod that contained 11 years of loyalty and 1 period of failure and the ongoing daily work of being a man who had been trusted again and was not going to waste it. Luke nodded back. 3 days after the wedding, Luke found the last thing his father had left him. He found it while moving a cabinet in the study to make room for the second desk that Abigail's partnership in the operation now justified. The cabinet had sat against the north wall since before he was born, and when he pulled it away from the wall, he found fixed to the back of it with a small nail, a folded piece of paper that had been there long enough that the fold had become permanent. He unfolded it. It was not a letter. It was not a journal entry. It was a list, his father's handwriting, the careful, deliberate version of figures. Dates and amounts going back 26 years. Every payment made to the Hayes family, through every anonymous arrangement Samuel Mercer had constructed to repair what he had broken. At the bottom, below the last figure, his father had written one line. Still not enough. But everything I had. Luke stood with the paper in the study where his father had sat for 40 years, and where Abigail now sat for as many hours as he did, and felt the particular grief that is not tragic, but is still grief. The grief of understanding a person completely only after you no longer have the chance to tell them you understand. He folded the paper. He put it with the other letters in the box that now held all of them. The original letter, Abigail had carried the journal, the second letter from behind the drawer, and this last one, the accounting of a man's long attempt to be worthy of his own mistakes. He carried the box to the desk where Abigail was working and set it in front of her. She looked up. "Everything he left," Luke said. "It belongs to both of us." She looked at the box. She looked at him. She opened it and took out the accounting list and read the last line in silence. When she set it down, she was not composed the way she was usually composed. She was something else, something that did not have a precise name, but was made of grief and gratitude, and the particular exhaustion of finally fully understanding something that has been unresolved for a very long time. "He spent his whole life trying to fix it," she said. "Yes. And he never thought it was enough." No. She looked at the list for another moment. "It was enough," she said. "It was more than enough. He gave my father back his dignity. He gave my father the belief that the world had good in it. He gave me—" She stopped. She looked at Luke. "He gave me here." Luke sat down across from her. "He gave me you," he said. She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "He gave us each other." The Mercer Ranch ran through that spring and into summer with a prosperity that was not dramatic. It was not the prosperity of sudden luck or single fortunate decisions, but the steady compounding prosperity of an operation managed with intelligence and worked with commitment. The kind that builds year over year and does not collapse in a single bad season because it has been built correctly. Tom became the youngest foreman in the county's recent memory. Callum had proposed it himself, which surprised everyone, and surprised no one, because Callum Briggs understood better than anyone what it meant to be given a chance you hadn't fully earned yet, and how a person should respond to it. Abigail's name went on the deed in June. Luke had asked Aldrich to draw the amendment the week after the wedding, and had not told her until the document arrived, because he wanted to hand it to her rather than discuss it. And the look on her face when she understood what she was holding was the kind of thing a man does not manufacture occasions for. It either happens or it doesn't, and he had made sure it happened. She held the deed for a long time. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I did it." She looked at him with the full expression, the one without the careful management, the one that was simply and completely her. "Samuel Mercer," she said quietly, "raised a good man." "He tried," Luke said. "He succeeded," she said. And that was the end of that. The box of letters sat on the shelf in the study between the account books and the cattle registry in the room where two desks now faced each other across a shared space in the house where a knock at midnight had started everything. On the anniversary of that knock, a crisp October evening 1 year on, Luke came in from the north pasture to find Abigail at her desk with the box open and the letters spread in front of her. She looked up when he came in. "Reading them again?" he said. "Reading the accounting list?" she said. "I've been thinking about it." "What about it?" She looked at the list in her hands. All these years he kept track, every figure, every date, as though if the numbers were precise enough, it would mean something more than the numbers. "It did mean something more," Luke said. "I know." She set the list down. "I think he needed to see it written to believe he was doing enough, even when he knew he wasn't." She paused. "I understand that." Luke pulled his chair around to her side of the desk, the way he had learned to do in the early weeks, and sat beside her and looked at his father's accounting in her hands. He was doing enough, he said. He was doing everything he could. "Yes," she said. "That's what I've decided." She folded the list and put it back in the box. "That's what I want to believe about him, that everything he could do was enough, because it brought us here." She closed the box. Outside, the October evening was doing what October in Montana does, pressing in cold and clear and enormous, the kind of sky that makes a person feel simultaneously very small and very exactly placed in the world, as though the smallness and the placement are the same thing. Inside the Mercer Ranch study with the account books balanced and the cattle settled, and the deed with 2 names on it filed at the county clerk and the letters in their box on the shelf. Luke Mercer put his arm around his wife and Abigail. Mercer leaned against him, and the ranch held them both in the way that land holds. The people who have chosen it, and been chosen by it, not gently, not easily but permanently, with the particular faithfulness of something that has been built to last. Samuel Mercer had spent his life building something worth coming home to. He had not lived to see it finished. But it was finished now, not by his hands, but by the 2 people he had trusted, with everything he had, who had taken his love and his guilt and his long, imperfect, entirely human attempt at redemption, and built from it something he could not have built himself, a family that had chosen each other freely on purpose with clear eyes and would not be moved. That was his last gift. That was enough.